Thanks for joining us. Nice to have you along this afternoon. I know you're all very busy. We've got the data to prove it. So we're going to get straight into it. My name's Chris Unit. I run One Further. If you don't know about us, we help cultural organisations use data and insights to better understand and engage with their audiences online. We do that by being really good at things like digital analytics and usability testing and content strategy and things like that. I'm joined today by two of the several brilliant people that I get to work with on a daily basis. We've got Georgina Brooke. Georgina Brooke is a content strategist here at One Further. Her background involves roles at the Government Digital Service, Oxford University, museums, and National Museums of Scotland, just before she came and joined us, where she ran the digital content team. And she's also responsible for the very popular cultural content newsletter, which is, I'm a little bit worried, not in the not too distant future going to overtake the popularity of my newsletter, but let's not get into that. If you're into cultural content and if you're here and you're not, that'd be weird, then subscribe to that because it's really good. And we're also joined by Louise Cohen, who's also a content strategist at One Further. Joined us earlier this year, having worked in all sorts of interesting places, the Times, Tate, where we first met, but Louise doesn't remember that, and then the Royal Academy of Arts, where she led the creation of an award-winning and very much referenced, copied and pasted digital content strategy, and rose to become their acting head of digital. Right, I'm going to do a little bit of background, only a small bit, and I'm going to tell you about some of the data that we've collected, and then we're going to get into the findings and the interesting bit of it. So we did a survey. The reason we did a survey is that, so we're very fortunate to work with all sorts of amazing arts and cultural organisations in the UK, increasingly in the US, Australia, Europe, elsewhere. In the course of that work, you pick up all sorts of ideas and impressions about how organisations are managing their digital output. Very aware in the work that we do that's, I mean, it's fairly anecdotal, really, and we're really keen to get an idea of where that kind of thing sits in the grander picture of everything. So what better thing to do than to foist yet another survey upon the sector? It had 20 questions. We got 169 responses in all, from all over the place. It's mostly UK, a fair chunk from the US as well, and then a little bit, a smattering of others. We tried to incentivize this, so thank you to everyone who submitted something. We planted trees, and we also said that for every submission that we were going to donate to the Ukraine Humanitarian Fund as well. So thank you again for doing that. We wanted to make your time doing this worthwhile. So thank you to everyone who's been involved in pulling that together. Let's show you some charts and stuff. So we asked people to group themselves as closely as possible into a fairly small number of buckets. You work in the cultural sector, you realise there is a huge variety of organisations out there, and trying to come up with a definition for all of them is a really thankless task. So we asked people to split themselves mostly into galleries, libraries and museums, GLAM, or performing arts, and then like a heritage bucket. Other included multi-art form venues and festivals and film organisations and all sorts. But we wanted to get those larger buckets because working with museums, working with performing arts organisations, we definitely see a different approach to the kinds of content that they're producing and the kinds of objectives they're trying to realise with that. So having that would be useful. We also asked people how many people work at their organisations, and so you can see here that compared to numbers you might be able to pluck out that describe the cultural sector more generally, our weighting is towards the sort of mid to larger size. There is a huge number of micro organisations in this sector that are probably a little bit underrepresented in this. The other thing to say in this is that the larger organizations are still, in the wider scheme of things, small organizations. They're not, the biggest organizations aren't huge. Brilliant article that I was reading the other day, which was an interview with someone at the Washington Post talking about how their Instagram team was 8 or 9 people just for one channel. There are organizations working much bigger scales with might compare the output that you're doing to that of brands and publishers occasionally, but it's worth considering the biggest organizations don't have that amount of resource to direct at this kind of stuff. So that's who we're talking to. And looking at who's signed up for this webinar, it's we do seem to be talking to the sort of the mid to larger sized organizations. We tried to boil this down to a few big themes and trends that were emerging from it. And so we've got 6 big stories that came out from the survey that you'll find in the report. At this point, I'm going to welcome back Georgina Brooke. I'm going to take you through some of the data. Georgina can explain it. So the first one, we asked people which of these challenges hamper your ability to produce digital content. And there was a fair spread of things in there, but the one that people flagged up as being constantly an issue was finding the time. This is probably not going to be a big surprise to you if you work in the sector. There are all sorts of other things that may or may not cause issues for people. The one that we were interested in, that last one, the adverse reactions and trolling, there is, with culture war stuff going on, I've heard a little bit about the chilling effect of just worrying or double thinking what it is that you're going to publish, but that didn't seem to be a huge issue for people. But it was the finding the time that was really the main thing here. Just to highlight that one if you haven't spotted it already. And of the many quotes that we got, this was this kind of sums it up. There's a difference between knowing what you need to do to succeed and having the time to deliver it, which is frustrating. That's something that came through a few times. It's not that people don't know, it's just finding the time to do everything and to do it to the standard that's required. So hopefully that resonates. It's probably not a huge surprise. The next one that we asked was, what are you trying to achieve with your content? And what we found here was that we asked people to identify a primary goal of their digital content. Very difficult to do that. Digital content is a huge, wide-ranging area, but we asked people to say what the primary goal was, and then what was very important or not very important. There wasn't a great deal that wasn't very important. I would call out the first 2 of these that seem to be the most important across everyone. So reaching new audiences and especially engaging existing audiences, which I thought was interesting. The one that flummoxed me was I looked into the promoting events or exhibitions. We're going to do a little bit more comparison on the performing arts versus museum side of things. From my anecdotal experience, I expected more performing arts organisations to flag this as their priority or very important, and actually it wasn't. Looking at that cohort, the reasons that performing arts organisations were producing digital content ranged just as widely across all of these things.
So we're condensing quite a lot of data here, but essentially what we thought was interesting about this slide was that, as Chris has already mentioned, people are seeming to indicate that everything is very important. And some of the other charts that we'll go through later in this presentation indicate that the biggest challenge facing digital teams at the moment is the volume of tasks they have to perform. And I think this slide and this data point really speaks to that. But one of the things that's also become clear, both in this bit of work, but also in some of our other work, including a bit of work that we're presenting at the Museums Computer Group conference in a couple of weeks, is that a lot of the visible things that we hear about in the sector, like burnout and people not having enough time. Really, these come down to often lack of confidence in strategy. So one of the slides that we didn't put in here was, if people had £10,000 to spend on any area of digital, where would they spend it? And the largest segment of that was on strategy. So I think that's kind of interesting, and I think this slide speaks to that to some extent, that if people are finding that everything is important, that to some extent speaks to having a lack of prioritization or a lack of strategy. And it's a bit of a moot point whether that comes down to digital strategy specifically, or wider organizational strategy. You know, we've heard from museums that have been waiting to create a digital strategy until the last few months because they haven't yet had an updated organizational strategy to work with. And if you think about the amount of decisions the digital teams had to make in the last 2 years, not having an overarching organizational strategy to hang that on is going to be quite debilitating in terms of having a digital strategy that you can get wider organizational buy-in. That's going to be very difficult to achieve without an updated organizational strategy. So the wider point, I think, from this slide that I wanted to make is that it is very difficult to innovate if your intro is already at 110%, which is sort of what it's sounding like at the moment. Related to that, it's interesting to think, you know, if we can offset some of the sort of resource constraints that teams are under at the moment through the use of digital tools. It's we asked this question: how many of these different content tools do you use, to get a sense of sort of where attention was being focused in that way. And in some areas, these bars are grayed out, but the ones with the highest blue component are the ones where most people had an example of, for example, a content plan or branding guidelines. These were sort of widely in evidence, but less widely in evidence were things like platform-specific tone of voice guidelines. So having a document which sort of describes how your voice on, for example, Twitter is going to be different from on your collections online web pages, but also by far the sort of least likely tool or plan for organizations to have is an SEO plan. And I think lack of planning around SEO or search engine optimization is quite significant. So if we take knowledge-based institutions like GLAMs, garden libraries and museums, these organizations have a lot of unique content and stories to tell, but frequently what we're seeing is that these organizations are prioritizing social media over well-optimized web articles. And whilst this isn't wrong, it does set you up to having to feed the beast. So for example, if you post a bit of content today on social media, or certainly the traditional social media, Facebook, Twitter and Instagram, in 2 weeks' time, you're not going to be getting all that much traction in terms of page views or link clicks or engagement on that bit of content. Whereas search engine optimization, if it's done well, you invest that upfront time and then over a period of years, you accrue considerably more page views and attention from audiences that share an interest in the niches that you serve.
We asked people how they plan their content, and it seems that only 15% of the respondents have a clearly defined content plan, and they schedule content well in advance. I intend to go and have a look and just see if there's anything about those organizations that enables them to do that. When we said there is no plan, that's overcooking it, I think. Actually, plenty of organizations do have a plan, but that plan is loose and it needs to adapt to circumstances and whatever might get thrown in an organization's direction. For better or worse, sometimes it's good for that plan to stick around, sometimes it's that agility is useful. It was interesting to see where people place themselves on that continuum.
So I think also speaking to that, we asked how much time was spent creating content with a short-term shelf life versus evergreen content. And whilst there is a spread across here, the weighting's definitely towards the short-term shelf life. So picking up that slide about planning not being hugely in evidence, and that previous slide about the proportion of attention being more towards social media and less around search engine optimized web articles, this is sort of reinforcing those points again. So in the long term, this sort of short-term focus will impede organizations' ability to create permanent products that allow them to build their presence around subject matter areas or unique online experiences that they could own in the digital space.
We asked people what content is produced within organisations, and the survey was targeted at people who work within cultural organisations themselves. So we asked them who produces it. Is it done in-house, or is it outsourced, or is it a mix of the two? And the results of this weren't desperately surprising, really. The ones that I think it's worth calling out are the kind of the multimedia ones, so the photography, live streams, videos, podcasts, and audio. They're much more likely to be a mix of things. I mean, photography, you can see getting a professional in to come and do some like rehearsal behind the scenes, or stage photography, or some like, I don't know, drone shots or something like that. Whereas, but at the same time, you might just have someone going around with their phone trying to do the sort of capturing the day-to-day activity through photography. And I imagine it's the same through video as well. It was interesting that that is the portion that is more likely to be outsourced. And I think it's interesting seeing this in the context of other sectors, where brands are much more likely to outsource all sorts of things, including social media production, to agencies to look after that.
So I think picking up on Chris's slide, it's interesting. So what this slide shows is that we asked people how they felt about the quality of the content that they produce. And you can see the sort of varying responses here. What's interesting to me is that photography and video are selected as people have indicated that these were the two that they had the highest confidence in. But if we compare this with the data on the previous slide, those are also the two elements that are most likely to be outsourced. So I think this speaks to a lot of the points we've been bringing up already, that digital professionals are expected to be jack of all trades, to be expert at social media, to be great at multimedia production, to be great at web content. So in some ways, it's not surprising that they don't feel confident in their ability to deliver all of that to the highest possible quality. And actually, I'd say if you were going to outsource any of these things, maybe photography and video wouldn't be the most important. You know, maybe you'd want to be feeling really confident in your collections pages or your exhibition pages.
We did a bit of work together was it last year for someone, and we identified that they were missing a big chunk of what should be fairly well SEO optimized content around the subject matter. They just hadn't produced that. And one of the ideas that we floated was just coming up with a content plan, and being as busy as they were, just finding a good copywriter to produce a good chunk of articles. It's probably not the most glamorous content that they would have on their site, and could be done by a generalist. It was an organization of specialists, really, and that's the kind of content they wanted to produce. So maybe in that sense, it would have been good for them to have got that done by someone else. But I don't think it was seen as that much of a priority at the time. What else we ask? Oh yes, so digital staff being a content bottleneck. I'm sure many people on this webinar will be saying for perfectly good reasons, but this quote kind of summed this up. It's hard for the digital team, who have to funnel the entire organization and so many projects through themselves and be part of everyone's work in a way that other departments just don't, which I imagine is something that probably resonates with a bunch of you. Everything comes through you at some point. Hugely varied organizations to be funneled through a very limited number of channels, maintain good relationships with everyone, and represent the widespread of work that you do. So Georgina, what did you find on this?
So yes, in this slide, it shows the results of the question where responsibility for different digital activities sit. And what's interesting here is that the majority of organizations filling out this survey don't have their own digital team. And I think that, that makes sense because smaller organizations just won't have the capacity to have a fully resourced digital team, and there's always going to be many more smaller scale organizations than there are, for example, national level organizations. So bearing that in mind, the most likely department for digital activity to sit is within marketing. The one exception to this is learning. So we found that learning resources were unique in some ways, in that the learning team would create learning resources and put those online. So in terms of the wider point about digital staff being a bottleneck, we can kind of imagine if you're an organization of 50 people and you have 1 to 2 people whose role incorporates digital, inevitably there's going to be quite a lot of pressure on those couple of people to get content out there, particularly if we think over the last 2 years, when certainly at some points that's been the only way that any messaging can go out. So that bottleneck point makes sense in that way. But I think another potentially less visible point is siloed knowledge can also be a problem in the sector. There's been some sort of brilliant case studies over the last 2 years. I'm thinking of sort of the Tank Museum's Patreon. I'm thinking of sort of TikTok successes. Oxford University Museum of Natural History did a brilliant escape room with Steve Backshaw that raised, I think, over £35,000 in donations on that one night alone, with very little upfront spend. But I think what's sort of unusual in those situations is that they've been a real blend of expertise. So it's not just marketing doing their own thing, sitting aside from curatorial doing their own thing, and learning doing something different again. It's a real coordinated approach between different expertise that the sector has and is really good at. And I think, again, this potentially comes back to strategy and the ability for different organisations to work in a coordinated fashion to a sort of central goal.
I'll just give a shout here to Adam Kazari's article on, I can't remember what it's called now, but it's something about you need 3 people to, is it to not make crap content or to make good? I can't remember which way around it was phrased.
And the other point I was going to make here is that digital as a field moves fast, but sector recruitment doesn't tend to generally. So just because digital has become an increasingly important part of sector practice doesn't necessarily mean that organisations have been able to afford new posts for professionals with these skills. So certainly smaller organisations are more likely to have to load digital responsibilities onto pre-existing roles like marketing. And it's not like digital, unlike a sort of field like conservation or something like that, it's not like digital has a really clear continuing professional development stream to it. You can't take a master's in how to create a viral tweet or TikTok. So the sort of onboarding process for staff that don't necessarily have that background is not straightforward. The other point I'd make is that until recently, most of the digital posts advertised in the sector were short-term, which creates precarity, not just for those in those roles, but also for the long-termism of digital plans within the organisation. You know, if your digital strategy or your digital engagement strategy rests on one person's ability to create a very specific type of content on one platform, and that person then leaves, then that's difficult for the kind of legacy of the organisation's long-term strategy. We asked people how content was produced, and the overwhelming percentage, so if we take these categories together, 82% of respondents said that they had a digital person or team responsible for creating digital content. And it's interesting to situate this data point up against some of the work that Carty Price and Dafford James did a couple of years ago in structuring for digital success. So we've been looking we've been thinking about how different teams structure their digital content and what that tells us in terms of digital maturity. So what we're finding from the responses from this survey is that it's most common for organisations to have a couple of digital people that are trying to corral quite a lot of input from a wider organisation, so more like that sort of centralised model on this screenshot. the advantage of something like a hub and spoke model is when digital practice is more embedded in different departments like learning and curatorial, and what the difference between those two is essentially that the input and content ideas that you get from different departments is more likely to be of a sort of high digital standard already in the hub and spoke model. So hopefully that sort of digital maturity is the direction that the sector's going in, but certainly at the moment it seems that more of a sort of top-down centralized model is what's prevailing at the moment.
Rebecca Leary in the chat's just been talking about the way that different teams are set up. It's not something that we investigated as part of this survey, so I would encourage you to have a look at at what Daft and Carty did, because it's very interesting. I think looking at the size of the organisations and the kinds of activities those organisations are doing, then some are too small to have hubs and spokes within them, and there are people who are just, you know, trying to conserve art and objects and trying to sell tickets on the doors and that kind of thing, rather than being weaved into a holistic or hub and spoke digital matrix of some sort. So it's a question of appropriateness. We didn't really get into it, but we would recommend you go and have a look at that if that's your bag. The last big story on this that we'll pull out is, a good chunk of people, 58%, have indicated that they intend to create more digital content over the next 12 months, which I thought was kind of remarkable after the spike that we've seen over the past few years. Lots of people talking about how there's been a bit of a retraction, like anecdotally, while organisations are getting back to trying to get people in through doors, sell tickets to shows, get those produced and put on, pull exhibitions together and so on. So to hear that 58% of organisations are intending to create more, right now I'm going to invite Louise back, and I'm going to hide myself for a little bit, so I'll catch you in a bit.
Hello. Thanks, Chris. So yeah, I mean, I'll start with my perspective on that. People want to do more, and that's where I jump in with the good news. People want to do more because digital content's awesome. And one of the, I mean, of course, as Georgina mentioned, the kind of big context to all this over the past sort of 2.5 years has been that all of the things that are challenging have been around digital content, and how it's produced have, of course, been exacerbated by the pandemic. But it was really great to see that a lot of the responses that came in also showed us some really positive implications of that work, because I think the bigger picture of what the pandemic did to digital content is shone a massive light on it, because, you know, it was the only game in town, right? So some of the things that we heard were that, you know, during a period of course, closure, digital and marketing teams had the opportunity to actually try things that they wouldn't have had time to do. They didn't have the same pressures of having to market things, trying to sell things. They perhaps, I won't say they didn't have stakeholders asking them for things, because I'm sure that they did, but perhaps the ideas and pressures on them were different, and that resulted in different approaches, different content. And as a result, confidence improved, and we saw different kinds of content emerging. We also have seen that it's been an opportunity to try different kinds of digital products that many organizations, particularly performing arts, had to innovate, had to look at new technologies, and many of them are now thinking about hybrid strategies and rolling those out into longer term strategies, which is great. And I think along with that, and not necessarily just in those kind of bigger projects, there's been an increased focus on access and on quality, which I think is something that everyone that works across digital content, that's something they would have wanted to see for a long time. And, you know, it's become understood that it's more important. And yeah, again, I think internally in many organizations, what we heard was that suddenly all eyes are on digital and everyone's interested, for better or worse. I'm sure some of you listening had some fun and less fun experiences of that. But I think overall what we heard was that there is a kind of more open and more interested attitude to what digital content can do and is doing. So yeah, people want to do more because there's more opportunity, and frankly, everyone did a really good job during COVID. So you know, that's a good place to be. The other kind of good news part of the story is that we've learned that digital content, you know, partly a result of it having been so damn good, is that audiences want more of it. So Georgina referred to another piece of work that One Further have done with Art Fund and Museums Association, which looked at the impact of digital work as organizations begin to emerge from the pandemic. And some of the key findings there showed that audiences generally, as Chris mentioned, audiences are kind of not taking up digital content at the same rate that they did while they were, of course, at home and unable to do anything else. But that behaviorally, there is an expectation of more access to content, and that behavior generally, it won't be what it was during the pandemic, but it also won't snap back to what it was before. And that organizations where they can are kind of wise to look ahead and think about what that means for them and how they can update their programming and their strategies. And the other thing that we found that was really interesting as part of that work in the research was that over a third of people who had access to digital content during the pandemic would be willing to pay for it now, having experienced it for free. Of course, that was published before the cost of living crisis, so TBC on that, but nonetheless. But of course, there's a big but. This is where the strategy side of things comes in. We know from the findings in this report, and we know anecdotally, we know from working with arts organizations, that a lot of organizations are not in a position to be responding to a wider strategy. Their organizations simply don't have that in place, or they don't have the time or resources to kind of invest in a kind of bigger digital strategy. And we know also, of course, that the pandemic was accompanied by, although, you know, there was a boom in digital content, at the same time, it was a time of incredible challenge and redundancies and restructures and staff cuts were happening. So, you know, another theme that's emerged is this kind of, you know, doing more with less. And we have to be really careful at that point, of course. I mean, as I'm sure you're all very aware, doing this kind of work, the worry is some of the findings in this report, if we put them all together, you know, the kind of 15%, only 15% scheduling in advance, everything's important, we don't have enough time in the day and we want to do more. The worry is if we jump into that without a strategy, you know, there's a really real risk of burnout. And we know that burnout is one of the kind of themes and challenges that has emerged for the sector as well, following the pandemic. So yeah, that is a kind of a big watch out, that these are huge opportunities, and we're, as a sector, we're in a great place, but we need to be thinking strategically as we do it. So on to our recommendations for how we might address this as a sector, or how organizations might take this forward. So the first one is to kind of stay in touch with your organization. I mean, it sounds obvious, but it's amazing how many strategies are created in a vacuum or without reference to the wider organization. So the ideal scenario, as Chris mentioned, is that, you know, you've come out of the pandemic, your organization's got a brand new shiny strategy and set of priorities and objectives, and that you create your digital content strategy straight out of that. Of course, we realize many organizations are not in that situation. And I think where that is the case, all you can do is make sure that the approach you're taking to your content is still as closely aligned with what you understand about the organizational mission and the organizational identity as you can. And that hopefully, if you've got a senior leadership that is half interested, that you keep them informed and, you know, you build their buy-in as you create your strategy, so that everyone is aligned, or at least aware of what's being created and why. this old chestnut, think about what you can stop. I mean, I say this in a kind of both a literal and non-literal way. I think often the ambition to do more comes with, you know, it's literally a new social media series or a new film, a new YouTube series, or you know, a new initiative of some kind. And I would really encourage you to think about which initiative you're stopping if you're starting to do that, because you know, it is a really challenging situation to just keep adding and adding and adding. But the other thing is, I guess, to try and notice tokenistic content creation, and you know, things like cross-posting across all channels just because. So maybe you do something because you've always done it, or somebody wants it and it's easier to just say yes, but actually it has no impact and it's stopping you from trying these other things. So, you know, I know these are internal challenging, these are things that are challenging to change at times, but I think it's worth keeping on noticing them. Well, those of you who have worked with me before will know I'm a huge fan of a light touch checklist. In fact, here we have one. I think there's so much that goes into a thoughtful content decision, and those of us that work in digital content are kind of so immersed in it that we're quite used to keeping in mind the organizational values, and we know this audience likes this, and actually we know this has to be accessible. But I think for our colleagues, it can be really difficult to sometimes understand the decisions that we're making. And for us as professionals also, you know, we have a lot to remember. Sometimes, practically speaking, it can be handy to have a little guide for ourselves. So I'm a big fan of creating quite kind of light touch, skimmable materials that we can use. Big fan of a content manifesto, some of you may remember. Keep investing in longer term success. So, you know, we understand that the pressure of immediate marketing and general firefighting is often all consuming. And it can be really difficult to spend time on this stuff that may feel less urgent. But I would say where you can, keep your eye on the longer term, because it will make your life easier. So one tip I often think about is, you know, if you've got to create editorial content or engagement content to promote something that's time dependent, is there a way that you can actually do it in an evergreen way that will help you build your SEO and will continue to drive traffic long after the exhibition or production has ended? So thinking about that content of the content of the production or exhibition, rather than necessarily the time specific aspects of it. Although of course there's a place for that too. The other thing is, I mean, you know, these are small things, but series content, templates, like stop reinventing the wheel. As far as possible, do something once and keep using it, and then if it's not working, change it. But you know, try and work in chunks and not quite so granularly. That can help. And finally, use data, but don't overcomplicate it. I mean, at one further, you know, obviously we're big into data. We do a lot of measuring, but our advice is always to measure only what you need. I think there can be a tendency to want to know everything, and it's quite exciting also when you find yourself in a position of being able to measure your KPIs, and you know, you've got your strategy in place. You kind of want to know everything, but it's actually really easy to overload yourself and your stakeholders. So stick to the few things that you need to know and share them with who you need to know, and hopefully that continues to you know, bring you all more clarity on what you're doing. So those are our few kind of recommendations for taking a strategic approach to digital. And yes, delighted to hear that if you were gifted 10K, 20% of you would spend it on strategy. Well done, those of you who said that, well done. And back to Chris for some next steps now, I think.
I'm going to wrap things up. There's a full report. It's got so much more in it. We only really skimmed the surface of it, and there's more in there. We've asked people about publishing content on your own site versus third-party platforms, things like social media, Google Arts and Culture, Khan Academy, like whatever the other platform might be. There's some things about measures of success, what people are using to judge the success of their content, the 10K question. There's some stuff about the effect of COVID-19, because I mean, it's still an issue really, isn't it? And tons and tons of relatable quotes for you to digest. So, so do grab that. And yeah, as far as what's next, so we've gone through, we've collated the findings, we pulled it together, we've put some recommendations together, we've tried to pull out themes, but we know there's more lurking in what we've got. So what we're going to do over the next little while is dip in occasionally and try and pull out interesting little facts and tidbits and so on. If you follow one further on social media, so probably Twitter and LinkedIn are probably the places where that stuff's going to show up. We'll do some little bite-sized stuff occasionally, just in case reading 20-page reports isn't really your thing and you just want something something bite-sized to snackable content. Still a thing? It was definitely a thing once. And then we also wanted to look at some comparisons. So I'm obsessed with this performing arts versus galleries, libraries and museums thing to see how things fall out there. We like to do larger versus smaller, as I mentioned before. At some point, we might even consider another report to see if things have shifted. So hopefully there'll be an appetite for that. We can maybe get a few more people involved that time around. So this isn't the end, but this is us launching it, and we plan to make hay with this over the coming whenevers. So yeah, follow us on socials. Content is good. We'll be putting some stuff out there.